I'm going to be refinishing this laminate countertop with a two-part epoxy. And this is Leggari's number 9 countertop kit. I removed the sink, I cleaned the countertop, and now I'm going to scuff it up with sandpaper so the primer sticks better. They recommend rounding off any square corners. So on this end, I'm going to round off the top and the bottom of this edge. I'm taping off the wall above the countertop with a painter's tape. This blue tape won't leave a residue when I pull it off. And I'm going to tape it off about 1/8 of an inch above the countertop. Because there's a space between the wall and the countertop, I'm going to fill that space with a painter's caulk. I'm using DAP's Fast Dry. You can paint over this in 20 minutes. I'm going to smooth the caulk with my finger, and I'm going to remove all of the excess caulk from the painter's tape, so at the end of the project it's going to be easy to remove the tape. Now I'm going to use blue painter's tape and tape off the cabinets just below the countertop and at the floor. I removed the top drawers and the filler plates so that it's going to be easier to tape off, easier to get the epoxy underneath this rounded edge, and it's going to be better when I put on my plastic to protect the cabinets. Now I'm going to take a lightweight plastic drop cloth and measure from the middle of my blue tape at the top of the cabinet to the middle of the blue tape I have below the cabinet. I'm going to cut it to size and hold it in place to that blue tape with a stickier masking tape. If you have a dishwasher and you plan on leaving it in place, make sure you completely tape it off. When you're applying the epoxy, some epoxy will be dripping off the end. Now I'm going to tape a drop cloth to the floor. I'm using a heavier duty drop cloth. This is a 2mm plastic. I taped it to the blue tape using masking tape under the cabinet, and I taped it to the floor using blue tape so it doesn't leave a residue. I added a border of paper drop cloth underneath the countertop where the epoxy will be dripping to help absorb it. I taped off the sink opening with plastic and masking tape. I'm going to be using a microfiber roller cover to apply the primer. I'm using the Rolling Dog Super Micro. Before you use a roller cover, roll it over masking tape before you use it to remove any loose fibers. The primer comes in 2 parts, a part A and a part B. We're going to mix them together in a container. Because part B is a little thicker, once I pour this into the container, I'm going to add 2 ounces of water into the B container, put the cap on, shake it well, and then pour it into my container where I'm going to mix A and B together. Once you've mixed A and B and your water, now you're going to stir it for about 3 minutes. I'm going to be using a paintbrush for the top of the backsplash and the corners. The products are low VOC, but make sure you have adequate ventilation. I'm going to be wearing a paint respirator. The primer is a very good sealer, so now that I've finished coating all of my countertop surfaces, I'm going to use this to seal the inside of the sink opening. You wouldn't want to do anything like this before you finish because you don't want to pick up particles. Allow the primer to dry before you put on your base coat. It's going to take 20 to 40 minutes depending on the temperature and the airflow. Now I'm going to mix part A for the base coat with the metallics in one container and part A for the highlights with the metallics in another container. If you're not able to put your epoxy over the primer the same day and you're going to let it dry a couple of days, make sure you lightly sand it and then wipe it down with a damp cloth. I'm going to be mixing part A of the base coat in a 5-gallon container. I'm going to be mixing it with a Hyde mixer, and this is for 5-gallon buckets. For the highlights, I'm going to be mixing it in a 2.5-quart container and mixing it with a Red Devil mixer. Wear a dust mask, an N95 or higher, when you pour in your metallics. It's a very fine powder. You're going to pour in part A, then pour in your metallics, and then mix it thoroughly. It's not going to start to harden until we put in part B, so there's no rush on this part. Make sure you allow this to fully drain out of the bucket. It's fairly thick, so just give it plenty of time to drain. You can even use a stirring stick just so it drains properly. While my base coat is draining, I'm going to pour out my highlights into this container. And you can see how thick it is. They want you to use a 3/8 nap roller to smooth out the epoxy. I'm going to be using the Rolling Dog Smooth Pro. The fibers are bonded to the core. Remove any loose fibers with some painter's tape. For the proper thickness, they want the base coat to be applied 1 gallon for 33 square feet. So what I did was I measured the square inches on the countertop in the kitchen, and I'm going to be doing this in 2 separate steps. I'm going to be putting the epoxy on the kitchen countertop first, and then I'm going to mix a different batch of epoxy for the 2 countertops I have here in the garage, because that way I don't have to worry about it hardening too fast. The ratio between part A and part B is 2 to 1. So I figured out the ounces per square inches, and I want a total of 66 ounces. So I'm going to put 44 ounces of part A in a bucket, 22 ounces of part B, mix them together, and then get it onto the countertop immediately. The products are low VOC, but make sure you have proper ventilation. I'm going to be wearing a paint respirator. Leggari recommends once you mix your first batch of part A and part B, pour this into a new container and scrape out the old container. That way part A and part B is mixed thoroughly. You don't want any areas where both parts didn't mix properly. You want to pour it out pretty even in the center. Don't get too close to the edge. And because I have a backsplash, I'm going to pour a small amount along the backsplash. Now start on the countertop and just start moving it with the roller cover. You're just trying to get it even. Don't let it roll off the side yet. As I'm moving this, you're just trying to use the roller to evenly coat the surface and just allow it to slide lightly. It seems like I have a little more product on this side than the other, so I'm just going to roll a little up on the roller and bring it over to this side and then spread it evenly. I'm going to start working the backsplash all the way across and pull it down. Once you have a uniform coat, then you're going to pull it close to the edge and start working the edges. Now I'm going to mix my highlights. They send you 30 ounces of highlights with this kit. They only recommend using a small amount, so I'm going to use 6 ounces of highlights for the kitchen area. It's a 2-to-1 formula also, so I'm going to be mixing 4 ounces of part A of the highlights to 2 ounces of part B. They want you to pour the highlights in random swirls throughout the countertop, a small amount if you have a backsplash, and get it towards the edges. And then you're going to be mixing this with the roller cover in a swirling action and a random pattern throughout the countertop. Make sure you get the edges I've got a little excess on the backsplash, so I'm just using a good quality brush and moving the product and removing the excess. As it starts to cure, you can work along the bottom and use a brush and just pull off the excess drips. This is how it looks after 24 hours. I think it turned out great. Don't worry about roller marks when you're finishing up the epoxy because it's all going to blend together. Now I'm going to put a coat of urethane on top of the epoxy. This is a 3-to-1 formula. I'm going to mix 3 parts A to 1 part B. If you're mixing the entire amount, this comes 15 ounces of A, 5 ounces of B, which would give us 20 ounces. To that you would add 10% water. So I'll be adding 2 ounces of water to this. I'll mix it thoroughly in a container with a stirring stick. If you apply the urethane within 24 hours, you don't have to sand the epoxy. If it's after 24 hours, you can lightly sand the epoxy with a 220 grit sandpaper or higher. I'm going to be using a paintbrush for the corners and the top of the backsplash and a 3/8 snap roller cover, and I removed loose fibers with painter's tape. Anywhere it's thick or pooled, I'll pull this smooth with my paintbrush and then roll into it. And after you've worked the area back and forth, then just lightly feather it with no pressure at all on the roller, just to blend it. I allowed the urethane to dry overnight. Now I'm going to take a utility knife and score the painter's tape where it meets the epoxy and remove all the tape. Allow it to cure for 7 days before you place heavy objects on it, and it will continue to get harder over 30 days. The finish turned out really good.